scripted things, but of course, you know the drill. So thank you very much for being part of the event. And of course, you've been part of so many sessions, and it's always been lovely talking to you, and the ideas that you brought in. So lovely. It's been really nice. So that's been really nice, but I will not let you come in up till you don't start. This is the new format. You have to talk about the conference.
Look, I strongly encourage you, if you are a mediator, a lawyer, a dispute resolution practitioner interested in mediation, come and engage in this conference, in this sharing of ideas. Vikram is bringing such diversity together, and it pushes us all to come together and share our stories, to learn and to grow. It's a really safe place to share your ideas and to learn and to have a conversation, which is really the business of what we all do. So the World Mediators Conference occurring from May till June, we're coming up to the end. Jump online and check it out.
Perfect. That's a nice thing. Look, if I keep saying it, it's the same message every time. So it just sounds nice and someone else. So thank you very much.
Hear you.
And of course, all recordings are on YouTube. Just search for Mediator Vikram. You'll find the channel. And now, Sarah, all about you, about the topic, multi-party disputes and mediation. So you taking it from here. You know that I never come into any discussion. I just stay listen. That's all.
Oh, look, well, thank you for having me again. And we were laughing before. I don't know whether people are getting sick of hearing from me as well, but I've really loved the chance to jump online and just share some of what I do with the profession, with fellow peacemakers across the globe. For those of you that haven't watched any of my previous conversations with Vikram, my name's Sarah Blake. I'm a mediator and conflict strategist. And what I'm really about is helping people have difficult conversations and make good decisions when there's difference, when there's disputes, and when there's confusion. And really that's the essence of what I do and why I do this work. I want to help bring us together and to be able to wrestle with those hard conversations, the messiness of life, and find ways to move forward. I'm a second generation practitioner. So my father's a barrister. And so I have the privilege of having grown up with the language of dispute resolution, of mediation, of discernment in groups of people. And my mum comes from a family passionate about social justice and bringing people together and supporting communities. So I kind of feel like I combine those two talents and passions, and feel very privileged to be working in this job is a vocation for me. It's something that is a part of my essence, not just a typical job. So I work with anyone from whole of communities who find themselves dealing with conflicts, to workplaces, to in the corporate and private sector, and with boards, and helping them to navigate this messiness of conflict. Today, I'm going to be talking to you all about multi-party disputes and mediation. If you're watching live, we'd love to hear your questions. Even put a note and say, tell us where you're from, so that we can start to engage and jump on this conference. Because you know what I love best about doing this, and what Vikram provides, is that everyone can be part of this conversation. You don't just have to listen to me. I want to hear your stories. I want to hear your examples of what this matters and why this matters to you. So jump on and join us and get talking. I hope that's all right, Vikram.
Perfect. Yes, that's the whole idea. That's the point was that you can have so many more people watching. But of course, I tell you, the issue that has come up, and the time concept, because everything that I did was in the evening. So like I told you earlier, Australia never got engaged. So now I'm thinking that I've got two aspects happening. You have Pacific time on one end. So early morning, not very early, maybe about 8:30 our time. So it'll be 8 o'clock their time on that end. And for you, of course, you won't be too bad. You'll be about 11 o'clock. But Sydney and all is not, for them, it becomes easier. So I will start those kind of things so that we can get more people into it.
Look, and it doesn't take much, everyone. I know that we're all busy, but sometimes even an hour of your time to invest in your professional development. What we're doing is we're bringing a curiosity and a growth mindset to the business that we do. And so the more conversations that we have, the more time out we take to learn and to grow, really enhances everybody. And it creates a more peaceful society, actually, because we're sharing our knowledge. So I really encourage everyone to do that. So today, let's dive into the conversation. When I was preparing for this session, I guess I had three questions that I wanted to take you through today. The first is, what are multi-party disputes from my own experience? Why are they so difficult to manage? And then what might we do differently for these cases as opposed to some of the other cases that we might deal with? Let's dive into that conversation. The reason why multi-party disputes is important to me, I've done a lot of work in the cross-cultural setting when it's native title and multi-parties. So you might have federal or state government, perhaps both. You might have your mining companies and your development companies. You might have multiple community groups and invested stakeholders. So that's one of the aspects of work that I do. Otherwise, I do development cases, for instance, where you have local government, where you have state government, where you have the developers, where you probably have special interest groups, like, for instance, environmentalism groups. You might have community groups themselves. So what you're starting to see is a picture of multiple stakeholders that are invested in this particular issue. As opposed to standard mediations where you might have multiple people involved. In this multi-party dispute setting, there are quite distinct interest groups. So each of these groups bring their own particular lens and focus to this problem that we're dealing with. Whereas some other standard mediations might have 2 to 3 parties, but those parties, there seems to be unification around what their understanding of the problem is. These multi-party disputes often and obviously have more than 2 key players. And there will generally be complex contributing factors. So as we try to frame and understand what is going on here, what are we driving towards, we necessarily have to look out and assess the conflict or dispute from multiple perspectives. So the contributing factors will include things like the legal issues. They'll probably include things like finances. They'll probably include things like environmental concern, maybe the cultural groups themselves, what are their particular interests. They'll include things like reputation and how do we work and create partnerships for moving forward. So there's complex contributing dynamics to these issues. And because of that, these cases are and include multiple interests. So in standard mediations, we'll talk about helping parties understand their interests, not just perhaps a legal definition, but digging deeper. That becomes a little bit more complicated when you have lots of different parties and you start to see the mix and the layering that happens in these multi-party disputes. They are also often a culmination of ongoing differences that were unable to be resolved early. Okay, so multi-party disputes often emerged because at the very genesis of the issue, there was a point of difference. And it was too hard or too difficult to juggle all these personality and groups to try to get them to resolve it. So they often look different from, say, a court-referred case, which has a very clear framework around a contract dispute, for instance. These multi-party disputes may include contractual issues, but they will very likely include a whole pile of underlying stuff that those points of difference that started very early on. Often they are driven by points of difference about values. So we talk about values shaping these issues significantly. Who I am, what's important to me, what's important to us as a group significantly impacts how we make a decision. And how we make a decision from, say, an environmental group, it will likely be very different from how a development organisation makes their engineering and construction and profit-related decisions. So we have to peel back these layers to really recognise that this isn't just about different interpretations of contract. Multi-party disputes represent layers of complexity that informs both how we make decisions and what the solution or the problem solving might look like. Culture, and not just from a perspective of different cultural experiences from your Indigenous, First Nations, Asian, Australian, non-Indigenous, all of those aspects, but culture within your group, who you are and how you are informed in your decision making. So you start to get a picture that multi-party disputes are much more than your standard mediation. And when we recognise and value them as a distinct, I guess, specialisation, you start to value that it requires quite a different approach to dealing with these issues. And I wanted us to understand a little bit about that. Why are they so complex? Why are they so difficult to manage? And one of the things I found really useful is shifting away from calling this a dispute or a conflict and saying, hey, we've got a really complex problem. We have to move into complex problem solving. And what that does for me is it kind of gives everyone involved permission to say, hey, it is complex. And we are talking about a big problem for all of us. And it doesn't put judgment to the allocation of blame. And that's really important, because in these multi-party disputes, one of the reasons why they are so difficult to navigate is because they often bring a lot of emotion. People feel very strongly about their particular frame of reference. And when there's a lot of emotions involved, it becomes very hard to make rational, good decisions. Now, that's hard enough when we're dealing with two people in a workplace dispute. But put your hat on and just imagine what it's like if you're also trying to manage 4 or 5 different parties. You know, you're having to deal with their emotions. You're having to deal with competing interests and understandings. And suddenly you start to really appreciate what it takes to manage a case, not just to do mediation work. So these difficult multi-party disputes, I often refer to them as high conflict. And I want to distinguish that from high conflict personalities, which you probably have heard about as well, because in a high conflict case, what I know is that these are the cases that have been going on for some time. They generally involve 2+ parties, generally more than 4. They are conflicts or disputes that are very values driven at the heart of it. So there's quite a lot of polarized thinking. So people have become positional. They become polarized thinking. In fact, there's quite a consistency about how people have normalized conflict itself. They've got quite used to just having a fight, because that's how they've been dealing with this over a period of time. And so people's emotions are very high. It's much harder in these high conflict cases to shift people into being ready to problem solve. We have to do a whole pile of work beforehand, before we can even start to think about what an agreement might look like. So I refer to these as high conflict cases, because for me, it's like a trigger or an alert. Hey, this process is going to require strategy. It's not just about following a staged, stepped process, a model, but it's going to require me to navigate and have a plan and understand the parties and their interests and juggle multiple layers of communication and conflict dynamics. So that's why I call it these are high conflict cases. There's high emotions, people are very embedded, there's diverse and polarized thinking, values often underpin it, and it takes a lot of work to move them from positional into problem solving. So as you can imagine, that can make managing and navigating these cases quite intimidating for those that haven't done this work before. And it can also lead to problems. When you haven't dealt with multi-party cases before, you often don't have a big toolkit. You think that you can just take what we do in standard mediations and translate that over to multi-party cases. And it just doesn't work, because we're having to think bigger. We're having to manage many more aspects of a case. And so it requires us to really do things differently. And I get really excited by this, because what I see happening globally really is a recognition that to make good decisions requires us to bring more people into the decision making. Complex problems require complex solutions. And to get diversity of thought, it means bringing in more people. We keep talking about wanting to celebrate our diversity and knowing that diversity enhances our decision making. But it's tricky, right? Because we've all got multiple interests, and we're not very good at doing a collaborative decision making when power is shared. And there's always some sharing of power, because otherwise it would be absolute rule and someone would just come in and do what they wanted. So we're having to negotiate. So I'm really excited by this, because if you think, from a global perspective, that it might be some disputes around mining development, for instance, and you have your state involved in negotiations, your multi-party company, corporation involved and invested. You'll have your community members, you'll have local politicians, you'll have probably environmental groups, you'll have perhaps international bodies, United Nations. You can start to see how easily one project requires multiple inputs. And it doesn't take much for something to go wrong and to create barriers to good decision making. So I think learning these skills of managing these complex cases will actually enhance the role of the mediator, or elevate the mediator style leader, because they've got a bigger toolkit to navigate these spaces. And this world needs good decision making, and we can't do it in isolation. So how might we approach these things differently? Gosh, I'm rushing through my notes, Vikram. I'm going to have to slow it down.
Why are you rushing? First of all, why?
I don't know. Well, I don't have people to talk to. Have I got any questions up on the thing yet?
There's
Vikram?
lots there. I don't want to disturb
Hit me
you.
with them.
No, I don't want to disturb you. Can tell me whenever you come in, but I was thinking that maybe you have something all in your mind. Let's just get it all out there.
Let's get it all out.
Is your son all right? You don't have to rush there. Is it?
I'm free today, Vikram. I've got a whole hour. I'm yours for a whole hour today.
Perfect. Look, in terms of hour, we can go. Of course, you put out an hour for us, but if you want to take it longer, that's not an issue, because there's no session after that.
Yep.
So you want me to come in? When do you want me to come in? You can tell me.
Well, I've talked about a fair bit of information. What stands out for you? Is that consistent with your understanding of these multi-party cases?
Yeah, because the thing is, one, of course, the political interests that get involved. Now, how much of a solution do they want? Because they've been playing on this for years. So first of all, that aspect. Then the history of it. Now, history of it, I will look at it from the perspective of the parties and also the mediator, because the mediator is the media themselves entrenched into it themselves in that particular thing, or they have been part of it because they've been part of the community or the country, and so the neutrality aspect also we'll be looking at. I mean, all these are things you will take up as you come. I'll put, like I said, I'll put them all out if you want together, or I can do it slowly. So if maybe these things, maybe you can take these things and then we can go further.
Yeah, look, I think that's really critical when we talk about multi-party disputes. And I think that's one of the distinctions around what I do very differently for these cases as opposed to standard cases. And that is, I spend much more time looking at context, because context in these matters has a profound impact. So we can't separate politics from managing these high conflict cases, because it is inherently contributing to both the situation and what an outcome might look like. And if we go in blind as mediators to some of those political dynamics, we actually we risk ourselves becoming part of the problem. So we have to understand some of those dynamics, or at least make sure we're surrounded by people that understand those dynamics. We also have to be, and I think this is part of the challenge for multi-party disputes, when people like the politicians or others have very vested interest in a particular outcome. Our job really is to safely explore and challenge those assumptions. And then if they are still focused on, because often they won't divulge their own personal interests, it'll be cloaked with other things. So I think as mediators, we have to be not suspicious, but maybe that is the right word, Vikram. We have to be looking for the underlying things that aren't spoken and how that might be impacting decision making. And it goes back really to what is our role in this space as mediators, as facilitators, that we need to be very clear about what our role is in this space of managing and mediating a multi-party dispute, because so much can go wrong. And not all of it is within our control. And we have to keep very clear boundaries on what's our job and what's not our job.
Because I'm telling you, the one thing that we have to look at is that, like I said, how much of a solution do they want, and to be active enough into the process that to be able to maybe get them on board, looking at their long-term interests, because
That's right.
finally there is something for them to benefit from
Yeah.
solutions. But they don't look at it that way, because definitely they've been going about to creating that whole issue around it. So that part of it, because look, I also, Sarah, because in this whole thing we also have to be able to bring out who are the parties that have to be on the table, because
That's
that
right.
part of it is always a challenge. So
Yeah.
how do you look at that?
Yeah, look, I think that I often hear that that's part of the big challenge. Personally, I don't struggle as much with that question. And I'm not sure if it's because of the way I go about my preparation and the mapping that I do. So I'm already attuned to the questions I need to ask to bring in the right people at the right time. But I think when we're clear around what our job is, we can start to say, well, who are the people that make decisions about this issue? And then if the process shifts and the question gets bigger or smaller, then I go back and I check, so do we still have the right people, or do we need to get other people in? So I think we need to move away from thinking that we only have the right people and they are the right people the whole way through the process. When we understand what are the questions we're resolving, or what are the decisions required, then we can start to say who are the right people for that decision. And so it requires a dynamic approach to process. So for instance, sometimes in communities, it might be you might have found the right person, but they don't have full authority over the whole issue. So if we go on to this piece of land, then we're actually going to have to bring other people in. So I think it is being really explicit in the nature of the decision required. And then we can ask the question of who are the right people at the right time.
Well, I just said about how, look, the thing is that there are people involved in that whole issue who are not there in front at all, who might never come in front. Let's look at the mining. Look at a mining project. Depending on what you're mining, let's look at a simple thing. Say coal. Now, coal is going to be used by industry. Now that industry has a vested interest to, of course, it's maybe cheaper fuel or whatever reasons they have. So are they going to be on board? They might never come on. You might not bring them on. So now there are certain things mined where these things are used by industry, yes, but then there are countries who are benefiting from it, from certain countries where they can mine this from. So are those countries going to be on the table, because they are the ones maybe controlling the entire thing? So sometimes I'm saying, can we go further up, and how much of that can happen really? How much of that will the governments want? I don't know. Maybe that's just
I think it's a really interesting question about how far up the chain do we go in terms of influencing on decision making. I guess you can reverse that, saying how far down to the ground does it impact? So who are the people that are most impacted by this, and who are the people who have the most influence right now? And we can't fix it all and we can't do everything, but what we can do is we can clarify some of those points. And if during the process we start to say, hey, this is a bigger issue and we need to have decisions at a higher level, then I would be saying of process, hey, let's capture that and let's push it up. That may not be our responsibility right now, but we can see that it's important. So let's have the courage to raise our voices collectively to that.
Because I'm saying that mediators sometimes, I think, may need to play a more active role, and not just being people whom parties say, okay, we'll bring this person. The mediator has an active role to say who should be the parties, because if you have to reach a solution, definitely without those people who are maybe the decision makers, maybe they are the decision makers, but on the table, you think, okay, in this group, this is the decision maker. So that part of it, I think the active role sometimes is not given to the mediators.
I think that's such a good point. And I think it speaks to style, mediator style. Some mediators are very happy just being, in a sense, the passive, neutral third party, and they take complete direction from parties. I guess I'm a little bit different, and and maybe it's because my philosophy, my values are about a broader issue about peacemaking and peacekeeping. So we can put a Band-Aid on this issue, in which case we'll take directive. But it doesn't always work if our end goal is, how do we help parties move on more effectively? So, for instance, I'm dealing with a workplace issue at the moment, and there's a couple of parties that traditionally you just bring these two people together to resolve this matter. But I know that in and of themselves, one of those parties doesn't have the required authority to make all of the decisions in the mediation. So I could just push on anyway, right? I could just get them together. We'll go through the process. We'll tick the box. They'll get some sort of agreement, but it won't really be useful back at work. So my approach now is to go up and say, hey, I could do this, but I also recognize there are some questions that are going to need somebody else with authority to make these, to respond to these questions on. How would you guys like to proceed? So what I do is I give them choice. I identify the problem and I give them choice. So it is passive, but it's not me becoming overly invested in the conflict either, because it's not my conflict.
Yeah. I think the other challenge is always the person or people who represent a group.
Yeah.
To bring them out, first of all, because they might not be obviously put out by the group, but to see the dynamics of the group and to bring that. So where do you look at that?
Look, those representatives can be your greatest asset or your biggest challenge in multi-party disputes. So if you're able to create a really productive working relationship with them, you kind of turning them into, in some ways, a extended team member of your own team. Whilst their primary interest is the parties, they are serving that broader interest. We want to try and get a resolution. So you need to be feathering out your allies in this process. And so, it's important to meet with them. It's important to talk about to them about your process, your style of engaging in this business. Talk to them about, hey, what do you think the barriers are? What do you think your client needs to hear? What do you think they're going to struggle to hear? What role do you think you play really well in helping us move this situation forward? Do you need more support? So all of those questions form part of the preparation with the representatives as well. I also talk about, hey, this is my expectation of your role. My responsibility is to manage this process. I need them to respect me and not undermine me, because that undermines everything. So I'm also establishing rules of engagement with the representatives, not just with the parties.
Because the way I'm looking at it is that now you have a community. So first of all, does the community throw out people who represent them, or is it because when you interact with the community separately and then you see the dynamics of that community and what's coming out? Because look, at one point you do want things to move in the right direction, but on the other end, you don't want to isolate anyone, because they are also influencers. There are a lot of influencers there. So but that balance, because people don't understand the challenge for mediators. I think they think it's very simple. It's just a facilitator there. It's a lot of things happening there. I think we have to put that out there. We have to put that out there.
Yes. We do. And I think that's, of these multi-party disputes, is a great way of highlighting those complexities that we are always juggling. And we are juggling tensions around who are the representatives and why. We're juggling tensions around, do we need to be flexible as we go through? Because that might change. In some communities, for instance, they'll have a legal representative, and then that relationship might break down midway through this process for other reasons, right? And then you're having to onboard a new representative. So you're always alert to those shifting sands. And juggling, how is this impacting on this process? And what is the core function of what we're here for today? Because we have to hold steady as mediators, and we have to hold the parameters around this dispute resolution process steady, because otherwise we either get drawn into the conflict itself, or we draw too much into the conflict and we've suddenly lost integrity. So as mediators, we are juggling all of those dynamics, let alone personalities, let alone multiple stakeholders, the emotions of people, the culture aspect. We're managing process and legalities, all of those things. We're having to think, we have multiple risks that we're managing throughout the whole process.
Yeah. The other, I think, and the other thing that you did touch on, but the diversity, equity, inclusion aspect
Yep.
of the entire process, I think
Yeah.
maybe just you would have to elaborate on that because there's lots happening there.
There's so much happening there. Look, one of the interesting things is research that reaffirms that good decision making is enhanced, or good decision making, we get better decision making when there's diverse thinking. And diverse, how do we get diverse thinking? We get diverse thinking not just from the way people think differently, but drawing on to diversity in general, and making sure that minorities are given a voice and heard, making sure we have cultural diversity, making sure our processes address and alert space for difference. And I think I came across a quote the other day about basically encouraging us all to make the assumption that there are differences. If you start from that assumption, you're going to really shift the way you engage, instead of just assuming we all understand a word or we all understand this process because it works. Assume that there's differences. And then that then makes space for people to be heard and valued. And when we do that well, we enhance a decision-making process. We increase the buy-in to any agreement. So parties will feel like they're invested in an agreement that might have been reached. They helped design, they helped contribute, they were listened, they were valued. They're invested in this working because they have to live with the outcome. And therefore, any agreement is more likely to be sustainable.
Because I think we have to look at it. Say, let's take an example. Say, the role of women in certain communities.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they can be influencers, but they might not be parties to the process as it's happening in front of you. So, how to get them in and get them engaged, but also the community sentiments also to be balanced. So, how do you do?
Look, what I always try to do is you have your core group of representatives in negotiation or mediation, but we have to have focus groups or other groups. So how do we take this information that's been digested, that's been explored and considered and listened to in this core group to ensure that those outside that core circle understand and that they feel like there's some legitimacy to this conversation? So we're always talking about, how do you take this information back to your family group, for instance? Or how do you take this information back to and have a chat with the women about it? And so you're planning the engagement process beyond that core circle. Now, you might not be facilitating it, but you're at least alerting people to that this has to happen. And then you design a way to allow a flow of information between those groups. Now, they may not be the core decision makers, but they, like you said, they're certainly influencers. And they are a dynamic that has to be managed and want to be engaged and heard. So I will always be looking for, let's go back and check in. Let's do a check-in. If these processes generally take months, so we need to schedule in regular check-ins with a broader group or specific diverse groups so that we make sure that information flow and cross-fertilization is happening.
But like you said, that the conversations happening at the back, you might not be able to facilitate them. How I'm looking at it is that can't we use things like social media to, I like what I'm doing here. Any of these conversations, they're not confidential conversations. This involves the entire community and everything. So let it be live streamed. Let those people who are influencers hear the actual conversations, because what some people take back and how they put it there might not be the best, because they might have their interests to put it there. So I feel that if we can use technology for these processes.
I think that's a great idea. One of the things that people are suspicious of is conversations and decisions that are made behind closed doors. And I think that suspicion, that lack of trust in institutions, has been something that governments are struggling and wrestling with. Organizations are struggling and wrestling with. People want to be informed and engaged. And if people have got used to, say, for instance, platforms like this over COVID, then what a wonderful idea that we can use them as a way to help people feel like they are part of the process and understand. I would probably say that I wouldn't use it all the time, but it might be a tool in your toolkit, that there's aspects of this conversation that we can have out in the open. And then there might be other aspects that we don't, but we can share with you how that goes outside of the group. So I think being alert to that need and using technology where it can enhance the process, not detract from it. I wouldn't do it perhaps if there was a high risk of that conversation inflaming the conflict. So my lens is always, am I contributing to good solutions, or am I going to inflame the conflict by doing this? So that, again, it's one of those tensions that we manage.
I'll tell you, you made a very nice whatever. I mean, just sent a message out that if you want to get involved, please get involved. Send a message here. Tell us where you are from.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of feeling someone listens to it,
Yeah.
feels a part of the entire conversation.
Yeah.
Maybe not sitting here. So if that message goes out, because look, there are vested interests on the other side who, if they're not represented on the table, will create issues at the back. These are, I mean, these are very, very sensitive, very sensitive issues.
Yep, absolutely.
So if they feel a part of it, and then whenever they have something to say, they can actually be brought in based on the comments and questions that they put on the chat. Look, I'm looking at it from exactly the way we do it, exactly the same way. That because
you know, like often, even if people are difficult in raising difficult issues and causing drama, there's probably a kernel of value in what they say. So making space for them to be heard and valued matters, and it matters in particularly bigger societal negotiations. I think there's a risk that we also don't want the conversation to go on and on and on and round, and so many people involved that it becomes stagnant. And I see that happening in organisations, that in their desire to be open and transparent and collaborative, it stagnates their capacity to make decisions. And so they just stay in this place of uncertainty and difference, and there aren't any solutions. So I think, again, that's a tension, right, that we're managing between, are we contributing to solutions, or are we allowing our differences to flame conflict?
Yeah, because look, on one end, you have to look at it as a long-term solution, because it's not just the fact that in that particular meeting, every party, all of them just agreed to something, but it is still a very tentative thing because they have to take it back. And when they take it back, what really transpired, what other people, look, the thing is that some person might represent a community, but their understanding of what's happening there itself might not be perfect. I mean,
we see this all the time in Australia. We're seeing it overseas as well, with these big multi-party disputes, and they haven't had the conversation about how we share this information back with our community. And an agreement is reached, and suddenly there's a whole section of the community that are not happy with this decision, and they might appeal to it. They might head out to the media. They might protest, and it results in this agreement that was reached not actually having legitimacy. And so it causes more conflict. You know, I can think of 2 cases recently in Australia where that happened. And I would say that whoever's managed the process hasn't managed those broader dynamics. We can't just make the assumption that because someone says they have authority and they represent a community, that that information is going back there. So we have to check. Our job is to check and double check and perhaps triple check. And that's why we need a team around us to help us do this work, because we can't possibly know it all. But we can start to alert ourselves to having an idea of what some of those questions might be that we need to ask.
Yeah, because look, finally, there is an expertise involved. The mediator has a certain expertise in, of course, facilitating conversations, but sometimes, like I said, to take an active role. So those conversations happening at the back, now that is important to how to be able to get everyone on board there. So getting them involved, definitely, I mean, it's important. The other thing is getting all these people together, all these various parties together by itself is a challenge, and it's a time-consuming process to bring them all together. And if that process goes back and people have totally different aspects to it, they come back later, we don't know when that's going to happen. And these are sensitive issues. You can't spend too much time also, because you don't know what, like I said, what very vested interest wants to take it in what direction. So I think that part of it being facilitated at the same time, I think we have to look at it. I mean, look, I'm saying that this might not have happened, so we have to see how it can be done. So that definitely. The other thing, interestingly, you were saying something. You wanted to say something?
No, keep going.
Okay. Because look, interestingly, things like climate change. Now, what happens is that there are discussions happening at a certain place, because sometimes you feel that this is an issue isolated to this place. But in climate every one part is connected to the other part in some other corner. How much of a cross-border implication of what you're doing is considered? That we have to see, because these are.
I love that. My guess is that on the whole, as the mediator field, probably hasn't looked particularly at the broader issues and how they interconnect globally. I think that we've been quite insular in our practice and insular in the conversations we're having around those bigger social issues. So I'm heartened by the work you're doing, but others too that are trying to bring more people into the conversation. And I think that's what it is. I think that as mediators, we need to get out of the habit of thinking that all it takes is one mediator, or all it takes is one particular, a small group of people to have this conversation. We need to take what we do and broaden it out. And for instance, my uncle continues to be involved in climate change issues from a farming perspective. He's a farmer, and I think they're ahead of their time, my family, in a way, in terms of caring for the country and the land. And what he's very good at is bridging the gap between farmers and academics. And if you know anything about this space, that's probably the biggest challenge around the language and the education. How do you bridge those spaces? And so as professionals, I love talking with him because I think it's a great example of how we take what we do in the day-to-day, even in the environmental space. How do we broaden that conversation out? How do we bring more people to the table? Maybe not in that particular dispute, but in a more broad perspective around how do we wrestle with these big issues? What can we learn from each other? And how do we collectively work on problem solving?
Yeah. You can tell us a little bit about it, what kind of issues came up and who all he involved and how the discussion expanded and how some better things came out of it. It'd be nice to hear this.
Look, his story is incredible and he's so humble about it and thinks that he's got nothing to say. And I am in constant awe of my uncle, who is just a regular farmer. He grew up on a farm. He never went to university. He doesn't value the expertise that he brings, but this man cares about our future and he cares about climate. And so what he did was he had this capacity and he just persevered in reading academic journals about environment, and he just kept reading and reading and reading until he understood enough to be able to connect it to his own experiences. And then he reached out and he developed relationships with those academics, those big experts in Canberra, and just reached out and just had a conversation. And what it did is it enabled a genuine connection. He was curious. He wanted to know more. Help me understand is a phrase that I often use. And that's exactly what he did. He made himself vulnerable by asking for help. But then what that enabled him to do is take that back to his community and take that back to fellow farmers who were like, who cares about this environmental stuff? I just need to earn some money for my family, which is also legitimate, right? But Brian was trying to get people to lift up their vision and think beyond tomorrow and into the future. And so he worked with some amazing people and he doesn't take any credit for them. But what he did is he helped groups of academics and politicians and farmers in the community come together and work out how to have conversations about these big issues with a focus on what can we do now to help our future.
Yeah, that's important. I think that is also the challenge for a mediator, because sometimes the whole concept of who is more qualified or who has this knowledge, and you focus on that, but on the other end, that person with that practical knowledge should not get left out. So that aspect is, I think, again, an important aspect.
Yeah, I am so proud of the work he does. And I'm so proud from an environmental perspective in terms of, you know, the little things that we can do to make a big difference, but also how critical it is that we take action now, and we can't just wait. And maybe that's a reminder for all of us as mediators too, is that, you know, there's lots of little things that we can do that can make a big difference, but we also can't sit back on our high horse and wait for someone else to drive it. We actually have to take responsibility for making a better future. As mediators, we need to become future focused ourselves. Being passive in just managing a process isn't going to create a better future. You know, we actually have to step up and own and engage in these critical skills and experience we have and how it can shape our world. We have a responsibility to really step up now. And that's what I really hope these sort of conversations do, is encourage everyone, whatever your experience level is, you each have something you can do to contribute to a better future. And it starts with curiosity, with relationship building, and working on problem solving together.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, the whole power imbalance aspect of it, and where the whole discussion that Bernie Mayer has had in this book also about neutrality and social change, I think those are important discussions to have, because finally there is a role to play, which sometimes gets lost in this whole, oh, this is just a facilitator kind of thing.
That's right.
We have to be able to put that out. But how do we put that out, Sarah? How do people understand that? What are we going to do for that?
I think, firstly, we as practitioners need to think differently about what we do. We need to make a choice whether or not we are brave enough to step into that space, because unless you make that choice, you'll always be second guessing yourself. So be really clear for yourselves about making that choice to contribute to the broader peacemaking journey. And then I think we need to clarify what it is that we do that is different. So just saying, oh, I'm a mediator, I can help, doesn't cut it. People don't really understand how that can help them move through these difficult social flux that's going on, this time of confusion. So we have to be able to bridge the language divide, the knowledge gaps. We have to take what we do and walk the talk. So some of the things that I do differently are, you know, I'm very focused on mapping and assessing risk, because that helps me understand where parties are at and what their needs are and what their language is, so that I can better bridge that space. I'm very conscious of, let's collaborate, let's co-design. What matters to you? How do you usually make decisions and deal with conflict? Does that fit with what I do, and does that fit with the other party? And how can we co-design something that has legitimate meaning? I also do things differently around, I don't have a precious ego, right? To do this business, we have to work as a team, both as an industry, but also in the particular jobs we do. So, you know, I think increasingly recognizing we can't do this in isolation. One mediator is not enough to manage these big issues. And that might mean we have to push back and say, hey, you need to find more money. If you want to do this properly, you need to find the money to make sure we have the team of people to do this and manage this right. You know, so it's us articulating our needs, articulating it's not just about facilitating managing a process, but it's also, how do we adjust the administration needs? How do we manage communications and the online and the tech aspect of it, making sure we've got our legal backsides covered? So recognizing that it takes a team of us working together, that we can't know everything. And that's the beauty of society and teams. I was listening to a podcast this morning reminding me that we do all think differently, and we all bring strengths and different weaknesses. And when we come together, that's how we best influence change.
Well, I think that the whole role of mediators has been underplayed. And I think mediators themselves have underplayed it, because like I told you, that whole concept of we are just facilitators. I think that aspect, has been one reason for them not being recognized the way they should be.
I agree. Do you know, to be honest, that's why I now call myself a conflict strategist, because it isn't just about doing mediation. It is about the strategy behind it. It is about an empowering aspect. To do my job well, I have to know what's going on. I have to be able to manage and assess risk. I have to manage personalities and dynamics. I have to plan out and I have to adjust. And then maybe do mediation, but maybe do something else. But so from me, this is a strategic role, not just an operational, let's do mediation.
Yeah, because I think that's something which, I don't know, I mean, is it something that we have to put out on paper and put it out as reports, then people will understand? I don't know how it's going to be. I think it's something like
it's a work in progress. I think the business of dispute resolution is growing. We're getting a greater understanding of what it takes to do this. So the research is starting to catch up with us. And now we have to translate that research, identify the gaps, and then find the bridge to communicate more effectively with the public. And until we do that end bit, then we're always going to be disempowering ourselves and disadvantaging the public because they don't really understand what it is we can do for them.
Well, I think of course, some part of it is what I've been doing. That say I talk to so many times. I've spoken to Louis Ore, the work he does, and those videos obviously are a little long. I'm not saying everyone would watch it, but he does take out little clips from that because I think a lot gets lost out there. What mediators do, how do we put it out? Because like I said, well, I mean, of course, that whole confidentiality on certain mediations, but not all mediations. So like I said, the multi-party, a lot of them might not be. So how do we get all of them to record either their experiences? If we can't do the process, I don't know, look, process will be something to be able to explain to people that it should be documented for the process itself. That's what, for the process itself. But otherwise,
look, it's hard, isn't it? And we need people to tell their stories. We need them to get it out there, but everyone gets so busy. Look, what I'm doing, all I can speak is what I'm doing. Look, where I get the opportunity to speak at events like yours, I take it. And I take it not for me, but because I feel a sense of responsibility to give back and have a conversation. So I do that. Others provide training and give back that way. You and I spoke about, I'm trying to get a book published with Mediators so that they can tell the story. So that's one of the things that I'm doing, that it's not just my voice, it's the voice from multiple people. I also I do a lot of media talking, and I don't talk about my cases, but do you know what? We can talk about conflict till the cows come home. There is conflict everywhere, and people just don't know. They don't understand it. They don't know what to do with it. They're fearful of it. So us normalizing that is really important. It's really important that we just get out there and we talk, and we make it okay to talk about these things.
I think that's the important thing, because that gets lost. Like I said, it should not get lost, because someone else somewhere will benefit from that experience. And I look, I'm not, I mean, we keep saying that, of course, I keep saying there are so many people with that mediator mindset, but bringing them out is not easy, because maybe they also don't know what it's all about, and they maybe don't even know that they have it in them. So when these stories go out, and they can actually, I am saying that if they can see the process and they'll see, oh, this is exactly what I do or can do, or is something that I will maybe just connect with.
You look, and I think that, you know, as mediators, or those with the mediator mindset, we don't have to know everything. So one of the things that lets me talk about it is I'm not afraid to say, hey, I don't know everything, and I'm going to get it wrong, and I'm going to make mistakes. But what I can do is I can talk, and I love to talk, and I'm curious about talking. And by doing that, I might just help one person. And you know what? That's enough. I did a radio interview months and months ago, and then got a phone call from an old lady that I'd never met her, I'd never heard her. And she said, oh, I just saw your thing recently, and do you have a time to chat? And I said, absolutely, I have a time to chat. And we talked about a conflict she and her son were trying to navigate. And we talked, and I just let her talk to me. And then at the end of it, I said, look, I really appreciate that you're feeling a very strong sense of injustice, that this isn't fair. I said, I don't know the details, but I know that when you feel like it isn't fair, that it really hurts and it takes a lot of energy. I said, you might want to keep having that fight, and that's okay. But just ask yourself, it takes a lot of energy, and it sounds like it's having a big cost. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe it might be time to park that and move on. And I said, I don't have the answer, but maybe. And we got to the end of the conversation and she said to me, thank you for listening to me. For the first time, I feel like it's time to move on and you've lightened my load. Now, this woman had lived with this conflict for over 10 years. And that's one person, okay? And it's not a big deal, but it's an example of how we can each make a difference to somebody's life. And that's the business of peacemaking.
No, I think what you said exactly is what I thought. You just took my words when you said, if like just one person sitting somewhere, that person's life is touched in some way, or they can resolve something, that's good enough. That's good enough. I mean,
that's it.
Yeah, because I keep saying, look, in terms of us doing mediations, how many can we do? There is a limitation of time.
Yes.
That's why I say that in terms of recording things.
Yeah.
Of course, I don't know, this conversation with that woman, maybe she might not have wanted it. Maybe. I don't know. We don't even know. If you ask that, we never know. But if that conversation recorded goes out and it's on Sarah's YouTube channel and someone watches it and relates to it, because issues are the same. I mean, people are going through the same thing and they're sitting there. They don't have that person to talk to because they haven't reached out, because they don't know that Sarah can actually. No, and they don't know that if they reach out, you'll actually have a conversation with them. They don't know.
Yeah. I love to talk.
But that every minute of your life, if it's out there, when all those very important conversations that you're having, if they can be recorded, and that's what I do. I record everything that I talk about. Whoever I talk to, only for this reason, because we don't know. Because the messages I get, I realize, and I've realized over time that people listen and people get inspired, or whatever way it touches their life. That's good enough. I mean,
do you know, that's why I'm so passionate about this work we do, is because we can all make a difference, and it's in how we live our lives, not just doing the mediation in a mediation room, but it's how we live our lives. And as mediators, we're equipped so much more, we're so much more in front of so many other people because of the training, the education, the mindset we bring to this. So there's little opportunities everywhere to further the culture of peacemaking. I did it last night with my kids. One of them had a run-in with another kid at school. And so we talked about it. We talked about how he felt. We talked about how they might deal with it differently. We talked about why this other person might have said it. Now, that's a little thing, but it's a seed that we plant and skills that we develop for the future. I did a workshop this morning on this same issue. So we're planting those seeds for peacemaking in the way we live our lives with integrity, not just in how we do mediation.
Sarah's creating the third generation now.
You know what? I hope they don't have to be mediators, but I have every faith that they will be peacemakers for another generation.
Exactly. That's what we need both. I've told you this is what I'm doing, and which is going to be a little more actively a lot of other things that I'm going to be putting out, maybe at the end of the conference, maybe on the last day, maybe I'll talk about it. But the whole concept is that those peacemakers are very important. And yesterday we were having a conversation, Lisa and I, changing society, and in that, this is what we spoke about, that one person who can reach out to the other side and actually get them on the table. Everyone can't do it, and that's a skill.
They can't.
And sometimes those, like I said, for people with a mediator mindset don't understand that skill they have, and those peacemakers don't know that skill that they have, because it is a way of life for them. So to be able for, of course, them to value it first, and then for communities and society to value that is what you have to tell me how that's going to happen. What do we have to do for that?
Oh, look, it sounds like a project, and it sounds like a project that we have to start small and grow out. And wouldn't that be wonderful, right? How do we build the bridge makers? And that's what we need as a society moving forward, because we can't do it in isolation. We need community and we need each other.
Absolutely. So, no tips for that? For the
you're putting me on the spot. Look, it really does start one conversation at a time. I do think that, and then you build out from that, and you apply the mediation model in a way to those conversations. So you build out pockets of, and you have a conversation. Hey, who are the peacemakers, and what does peacemaking and bridge building look like to you? Who are those people that you know? And then why do they do it, and what works? So we have to unpack that first before we can uplift. We have to give word and space and frame to help them identify that that's what they are, or that's who they know that does it. We give legitimacy to that, and then we build on that.
I think the important thing is to ask those right questions in a simple manner, but still be able to get that deeper answer. I think that's where the whole skill lies, in framing the questions. So Sarah is going to frame the questions for me.
I will frame you some questions and we'll put it out. And look, I would love to do that. I would love to let's start some of that. Let's put those questions out to all our listeners who've stuck with us for an hour. Let's put them out on the website and say, go off and have a conversation and get back to us. Let us know how it goes. This has to be all of us together.
Absolutely. But that's exactly what's going to start now, because that focus on their active role right now, it was the conversations, but I think now it has to be taken to the next level where you involve them, and then that further the whole cause, let me call it a cause, to be able to take it further. So I think we should do that, and I'll get you involved, and if you are looking at
I make the commitment to that, I will do it.
And of course you are looking at the time also, so it is time. If we can actually break it at this point, these conversations are going to continue, but please keep time for the last day. I've kept it in the morning also, because maybe it'll just be the two of us. We don't even know if there's any there is no one else from Australia. Okay, do we have no one else from Australia?
Look, I'll see what I can do. I got a few hits on my post, so I'll see what I can drum up for our last session.
But, because the key, for that you'll have to watch some. You'll have to watch some of those sessions and put your thoughts together, and let's see how do we take it forward. So Sarah, always a pleasure. Looking forward to the next conversation. So thank you very much.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you everyone too for listening to us right to the end. Hit us up with your questions, with your feedback, and keep up the business of peacemaking.